Hola, muy buenas tardes.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for sharing this session with us this afternoon. It is a pleasure for me to be with you, with Professor Mariana Mazzucato. As you know, she is a professor in economy, innovation, and public value in the University College of London, and she is also the director and founder of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She has assisted governments, and she has received plenty of awards, and she has also published several books that are really delightful. And for instance, Mission Economy, the Big Con, The Value of Everything, The Entrepreneur State. And one of the threads that really connect her works and all her academic career and her career in research is breaking with the cliches or the questioning of the commonplaces about economy and about capitalism. She has also this vocation of dissemination, of informing the general public. She has a great communication skills, and I think if we put together all these skills, all these values, we can easily understand why she is so influential in terms of the economic thinking. Even the Pope has highlighted this of her, and I think it is a fascinating time to be able to have a conversation with her. We are seeing that many innovations are taking place, many transformations. We don't know how revolutionary these could be. And I'm not only talking about AI, but we're also seeing plenty of challenges in politics and in the relations between the economic cycles and politics. And probably I'm talking about a commonplace because I don't think of any time in history that where it wouldn't be interesting to discuss or have a conversation with an economist.
Haré las preguntas en...
I will be asking her the questions in English, and we will start with a brief introduction of Professor. And if we will have a chat, and we will have also questions from the audience. I do not want to steal more time from this conversation.
Tengo un poco de vergüenza hablar en inglés.
I'm a little shy. I can speak Spanish, but I think you'll understand me better with the translators. I first of all want to thank you all for being here. It's an honor. Such a variety of different people with different backgrounds, different professions. And for me, it's very important what you just said. It's important for me to break those stereotypes.
Because we are living through a very, very difficult moment where we have multiple crises. We have the climate crisis. Funciona. Bien. The climate crisis, the health pandemic, which we just went through, and there will be more pandemics coming our way. Are we more prepared than before? I don't think so. We have all this technology, which of course we've always had, but the pace is increasing immensely. Are we able to govern it for the public interest? Or do we have what Shoshana Zuboff, my friend, says? She says, you think you're searching Google for free? Google is searching you for free. So all these challenges need collective intelligence. They need intelligence, collaboration, interesting dynamic ecosystems, that work together to treat the challenges as opportunities of working together well in the public interest, and I don't think we know how to do that. I have focused my work mainly on the side of the state, el Estado emprendedor. Why? Not because the state is more important than the private sector, but we have had such a difficulty in framing what is the role of the state in the economy beyond facilitating, making things easier for somebody, beyond fixing market failures, which is how economists frame it, beyond enabling. If we had, thought about the state as fixing a market failure, we would have never gone to the moon. more than 60 years ago. And the problems we have around climate, health, digital divide are harder than going to the moon. And so the reason I wrote, maybe I'll just give a bit of a pitch around mission economy. I know you were going to ask me, but I think it's a good example of what I'm talking about. We would have never gone to the moon, I think, if policy was done as it is being done today in most countries. So I don't believe we have the entrepreneurial state, el Estado emprendedor. I believe it's a possibility for the state to work well with others. We don't have it. And the story I usually tell about the moon landing is, first of all, how it began, when Kennedy said, we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy. So no one says that anymore, no? Like, we don't say we're going to do it because it's difficult, we're going to have to spend money, we're probably going to make a huge amount of mistakes, but we're going to learn along the way. He was very explicit. We're doing it because it's hard. First of all, that means you embrace uncertainty. You embrace the difficulty. You get different actors to work together on the difficult thing, which you admit from the beginning is hard. So you don't facilitate, no? Facilitar uno, facilita el otro, no. Second, they realized in NASA they needed to change the tools, the instruments of government. They focused initially on procurement, las compras públicas. We talked about it this morning with La Ministra Mónica Garcia, who I see twice in one day. It's an honor. They changed it from cost plus procurement, where it's just kind of, who's gonna procure school meals at the lowest cost. No, that's how we usually do the compras públicas. To what? Challenge-oriented, outcomes-oriented, fixed-price procurement with incentives for innovation and quality improvement. So they said, we need the tool, las compras públicas, a bit of a boring tool. We will make it dynamic. Yeah, why did they need that? Because there were so many problems, homework problems, tareas, along the way, right? The goal was to the moon and back in a short amount of time, but along the way, they had to solve, what would the astronauts wear? What would they eat? How would they go to the bathroom? Yeah, so it wasn't just aerospace. The public sector had a goal, but they needed to work with the private sector across many sectors, not just aerospace. It was nutrition, materials, electronics. And they used government tools like procurement, but we should talk about the other tools later, public banks, subsidies, guarantees, so on, to crowd in, to catalyze private sector initiative towards a public goal. So along the way, we got camera phones, foil blankets, baby formula, software. These were solutions to problems. Many of the solutions failed. We know the successful ones. So these dynamic spillovers along the way, were critical towards the mission accomplished. Even if they had blown up just before getting to the moon, you could still call it successful because of how they organized the government, the public sector activity to stimulate economy-wide innovation and investment. And my point today is the same should be done with our climate goals. The same should be done with our health goals. The same should be done with our digital divide goals. Clear direction, open on the how. You don't tell people what to do. You just say, we have a difficult problem. We will embrace the difficulty. We will get many sectors, so not a sector-focused industrial strategy. Intersectoral innovation. We will use every tool government has, from a public bank, los bancos de desarrollo, to public sector procurement, to the way subsidies and guarantees are structured. So they're not just handouts, but they catalyze, again, bottom-up experimentation towards a goal. And lastly, and I will shut up now, the interesting thing that they did was they were confident about their role. I often joke that I walk in as an economist and I come out as a life coach, like a therapist, because there's no confidence. I'm like, come on. The deal, no? They knew their role. So in the contracts, they had no excess profits, no rents. It's what Adam Smith called rents. Karl Marx called excess profits rents, no renditas. Profits, yes, profito sí, but not in excess. In excess of what? Of what you did. Because it's collective intelligence, real collaboration. So for me, it was so interesting that a space agency was confident enough to get a symbiotic, not a parasitic, public-private partnership, transformed the political economy tools like procurement to galvanize economy-wide transformation towards a goal. And we know how to do this with war. We know how to do it with the military-industrial complex. So why don't we do it for our social problems? Because we don't care. We know how to do it. It's not true we don't know. It's a choice we make not to apply what I call mission-oriented thinking, entrepreneurial state thinking to our social ills. And for me, that should put pressure on governments, hold them accountable. You know, why don't we treat as urgently our climate problem as we treat outcomes orientation either for a war or with COVID when it was too little too late. COVID was treated a bit like a war. It's not surprising we used defense tools. The Defense Production Procurement Act was used for vaccine procurement and for the personal protection equipment. But it was too late. You know, we should be using those to prepare ourselves to be stronger and more resilient.
I love the way you use the story about the mission to the moon in the book, in Mission Economy, to talk precisely about the entrepreneur capacity of government and as an innovation driver. And I got shocked by this speech by JFK, not only at the Rice University, which is the first time when he says, we're going to the moon, but when he addresses the Congress, and he said to the Congress people, this is going to be hard, and this is going to be very expensive. I've been 7 years there, I've seen 3 administrations, and I can't believe any president nowadays goes to Congress and say this is going to take a lot of taxpayers' money. Being fair with politicians, also society is not ready to hear a president to say, okay, this is going to be expensive. Do we allow them to do that?
But first of all, and by the way, I don't like war. So when I use the war metaphor, it's to say, why do we do things with war? With war, money comes out of thin air. Look at the Ukraine war, a terrible tragedy, but Germany, before the Ukraine war happened, they were having a fight in the government about money. And in the government, they were saying, there is no money and we need to have a trade-off. If you spend more on health, then there's less on education. Then, in order to take part of what ended up being a global, if you want, support for Ukraine, they created 190 billion overnight. Where was that money before? Why is it that we create money for war? And first of all, there's a whole theory, of course, of money creation from Hyman Minsky, Karl Marx, John Maynard Keynes. There's currently a whole stream of economics called modern monetary theory, which challenges governments, reminding them if they do have a sovereign currency, they can actually create money. But that's an academic debate. What my interest is, why do we, with health and education, for example, say that if you spend more on one, you have to spend less on the other, right? With war, no one says, oh, there's no tax revenue, sorry, we can't go to World War II. We can't go to Afghanistan. We can't go to Vietnam. There's no tax revenue. So they treat it as an urgent problem and they organize the system to deliver on what they're trying to do. And I come back to that because otherwise, we're just lying to ourselves, no? And in the US, of course, even under the Republican administrations, as long as it's something they think is good for business, including tax reduction, it increases the deficit, but no one really says anything. So again, it's a choice. And by the way, in Europe, in Spain, you had massive austerity, no? After the financial crisis, which was caused by private debt. We obsess about public debt, like even the question is about public money. Private, the financial crisis was caused by the private sector and the financial markets and the real estate sector bursting a bubble. And there was a lot of debt into the system, including people buying homes across the world in the US, which they couldn't afford. Very cheap mortgages were being created so that people who actually had pretty low income were buying, with these kind of false financial tools, their homes, and the bubble burst. After that, we blamed the public sector, remember, with austerity? So in order for Spain to get any support from Europe, they had to promise to reduce the deficit. And you reduced the deficit. I think you were even running a surplus at some point. Italy as well. The pigs. We were called pigs. Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. Goldman Sachs called us the pigs. Terrible. Anyway, we were all forced to reduce the deficits. What happened? Deficits fell. What happened to debt to GDP? It rose. Right? I mean, it's not rocket science. X over 0 is infinity, right? So if you're reducing your deficit, but by doing it stupidly, and in Spain, you cut publicly funded research and development by 40%, like during that period, in order to reduce deficits. If having a healthier population, a better research infrastructure, a better, stronger educational system, and better worker training for workers, all these things that require public money, if you cut those, it's not surprising that the denominator, sorry if I'm getting a bit technical, of debt to GDP falls, productivity falls, so you have this absurd situation of deficit falling, but debt to GDP rising. Yeah? But we haven't learned that lesson. So now after COVID, we have many countries finding themselves indebted, not because of the public money that was created during COVID and so on, and now saying, oh, now we have to tighten our belts again. No? Or we have recovery programs, like in Europe today, which is not austerity. We have 2 trillion euros in the next gen EU program, but it falls in countries that have not invested for the last 50 years inside the civil service. Yeah, so the ability to implement policy and to administer difficult policies and challenges is very low. So we have the absurd situation in Italy, even in the past, when we got money from Europe, like through the structural funds, sometimes the money had to be sent back because we couldn't implement it. It didn't land on a capable, well-resourced public sector. And this is why I wrote my recent book on GRAN ENGAño, which is, there's also a whole sector, the consulting sector, that has benefited from this weak state. But also companies benefit, because if you come into the room with the health minister, who's very ambitious, and I think the Minister Garcia and what she's trying to do, but also my colleagues in Brazil, where I'm working with the Minister Trindade, who's the health minister. If you're ambitious about putting health at the center of the economy, instead of just health here and economy here, you're going to want a better relationship with the business sector. Not one that is about access and not just money making and health, and you will be challenged. You will be told, I'm leaving your country if you mess around with intellectual property rights, no? Patentes, if you tax windfall profits in the energy sector, if you try to get prices of drugs to fall. So you need to be prepared, not only in terms of the capacity of numbers of civil servants, but in the ability to negotiate and to even understand well the sectors that you're governing. And if you cave in as soon as a business says, oh, oof, you want to regulate me, you want to reduce drug prices, as we have the ex-minister of Argentina here. You told me also the story in COVID where you were negotiating hard with the pharmaceutical companies that were trying to, in a very dysfunctional, parasitic way, one could argue, benefit, make billions on the back of a health pandemic. And if they threaten, we're leaving, I often say, give them a free ticket to the airport, because you don't want to be working with companies like that. But that's a stupid answer. You need the companies, you want to work well with the companies, but the question is, how do we embrace this moonshot approach, like the Apollo approach, an outcomes orientation, and drive a dynamic, symbiotic, mutualistic, not parasitic, not predator-prey ecosystem in health, in energy, in digital, and what is the capacity we need inside the civil service to do that, and the leadership, of course. Without leaders, nothing happens. So one of the leaders I'm working with now is Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados. She's incredible, but mayors, some mayors are really trying to transform their cities with housing as a human right, but you will face opposition. And so the narrative you said about debunking, no? We need a new story, a new narrative to underpin this new economics and this new practice, because the storytelling also matters. And if the storytellers have all the lawyers, and if the storytellers have all the capacity because companies invest within, they don't just outsource, then it will be very hard to defend and to be proactive in a system than to kind of cave into an immediate threat that business will leave as soon as you try to make it more functional.
You have stressed several important challenges here. Which of them would you say it's our mission to the moon nowadays?
I mean, climate change for sure, because we have no time left. No, the IPCC report, which comes out every year, recently, it was the most depressing one ever. They're basically saying it's almost too late, but we have numbers like there's 6, 7, 8 years left until the global heating, the global boiling. The word climate change is a bit neutral. Global heating is a bit more of serious until it's irreversible. So I don't think it's the only challenge. I do think being more prepared for the next pandemic so we don't have excess deaths. The digital divide is incredibly important. Remember, during the lockdown, many kids globally stopped accessing their human right to education, so inequality rose due to the digital divide. So these are all huge problems that require a moonshot approach. But the climate battle, it's the most important existential one, but it needs to land in concrete ways where citizens, public actors, private actors, but also citizen groups decide on exactly what the mission is. So it's not for an economist from Italy or from the UK to come to Spain to tell you what your missions are. That's, a country decides. However, every country, including Spain, including Argentina, including Italy, has signed up to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. Those are the big goals: no hunger, no poverty, climate change, life below water, the water problem, WASH, the access to enough water, but clean water. 2 billion people don't have access to clean water. These are the challenges which we have committed ourselves to, but they're too abstract. They need to land in a way that makes sense to people who then get involved, and that needs local negotiation, whether it's city level, regional, national. But if we don't have the democratic processes through which people and companies and public actors, but also citizen groups, can get involved, these things don't stick. They're introduced, but then a new election comes and someone just takes it away. When you build consensus, and I've seen it happen more at the community level, that's why I like working with cities or my own neighborhood, Camden in London, where I've worked quite a bit. I think it's through the community engagement also that you make people believe in politics again. Politics in the Aristotelian sense. Because as long as young people, or just people, no longer trust politicians and no longer trust even businesses and no longer trust the experts, in academia, they either just don't vote. So we don't have democracy if people don't vote, or they vote for the easy answer populist who comes on, and with an easy answer. It's all the fault of the immigrants. It's all the fault of the previous party. And I'm not saying people are stupid. They're not. But they're very disillusioned, and they have not benefited in many countries from all these grandstanding policies. So they rebel. In Italy we have this, Spain, you're holding on.
Global heating and Green New Deal. Let me follow up on the moon landing goal. In the 60s, in the middle of this moon fever, and also you mentioned this in your book, there was a blues songwriter who wrote a song which said, a rat bit my sister Nell, and the whiteys are on the moon. Her arms swell, and the whiteys are on the moon. I cannot pay doctor's bill, and the whiteys on the moon. Which talk about this frustration by people who felt left behind, felt and were left behind in the middle of all that fever. Nowadays, how can governments go through this new climate transition and avoid many people feeling left behind?
So first of all, that same song poem that I quote in the book also got reflected in another story I tell in the book, where a nun, I think she was a Buddhist nun, said to someone later after the Apollo program, to the head of NASA, "Why are you wasting all these billions in space where there's all this poverty on Earth?" And his response is really, really special. You should look at it. I don't know if you know the book Letters of Note. They're just famous letters that are very nice to read. And this was a letter between this nun and the head of NASA. And his response was beautiful. So it's worth reading if you can find it. I quote it in the book, so buy the book. But he basically said, "You're right. There's huge problems on Earth. However, if we look at many of the solutions that we've had on Earth to hunger, to medicines, to different problems that are earthly problems, they have often come out also of basic research that thought big. Like Antoine Saint-Exupéry, he had a beautiful poem. He said, what makes you create a ship? Is it just going to find wood, or is it dreaming of the big blue sea? No, that then, inspires kind of shipbuilding. So what is the dream that we have, and all those, as I said before, spillovers that happened along the way to the moon, the camera phones, the foil blankets, the baby formula, but also the medical innovations, have often come out of very difficult problems that required lots of science, where then the benefits get spilled over to other areas. So I just want to say that because it's an important point to make in an era where we unfortunately have a lot of backlash against science, and science needs to be protected, not just around the missions, but basic research we know has been fundamental for many advances, where often the search for one thing leads to the discovery of something completely different, the serendipity behind the science. But having said that, and that's just an important point, the bigger point of leaving people behind, that's a choice. Right? You can either have a green transition where you help workers be retrained, for example, from fossil fuel generated industry towards a sustainable transition, or you can just leave them behind. You can also either help companies that are in those sectors transition through repurposing the subsidies, not just getting rid of subsidies from one day to the next and just having every company in a sector that maybe needed those subsidies before die. You repurpose them so that you help the industry move in a direction. An example would be in Germany, where the steel sector, acero, required a loan from the public bank, and steel everywhere is asking for money because they're in trouble. But in Germany, because they have a very clear energy transition, they made the loan to the steel sector conditional to the sector reducing the material content of production. So the green steel in Germany happens not because the German entrepreneurs went to Davos, the World Economic Forum, to talk about purpose, but because they had to in order to get one penny out of the government. So that's a repurpose, no? Like instead of just giving a subsidy, the subsidy becomes repurposed to help that sector change. So creating additionality. So that's a sectoral example, but the labor issue, the reason we end up with the Gilets jaunes, no? The Gilets jaunes in France, who rebelled against some of the climate policies, or the reason why Trump can say to the US workers, green is not good for you. Look at the wages of the battery producers. They're lower than the wages of a trade union organized General Motors plant. That's a choice. But those things don't change just by government saying it's going to change. It changes due to a struggle. So in the US in November, the United Auto Workers, one of the biggest trade unions, labor unions in the US, one of the oldest, they had the first strike ever across the three big automobile companies, Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, and that was because, in fact, they were starting to see a race to the bottom because the battery workers that weren't unionized were earning about 1/3 less than the unionized workers, and it was creating a competition where the electrification agenda and the Tesla, Elon Musk agenda. Elon Musk doesn't believe in trade unions, neither does Jeff Bezos, by the way. And then they create a fund, the Bezos Earth Fund, to do good as opposed to having good corporate governance. Anyway, we can talk about philanthropy. Maybe we should, because foundations, where does the money come from? There should be good business, no? Working with good government and good other actors, and you make profits. And if those excess profits are being generated by bad corporate governance, like in Amazon, we don't need the charity, we don't need the philanthropy. Pay your tax, pay workers well, and then let's see how much money is left over to then create the Bezos Earth Fund to do climate change. Anyway, don't get me started on Now, I've lost track of what I was saying because when I start talking about, however, foundations do have a role. They do have a very important role, but not to make up for shitty business and shitty government. What was I saying? What was the question?
I think your next book is about foundations. Like
I should be, yeah.
Don't be worried. Everything will be fine.
No, sorry, leaving people behind. So the workers' movement, the labor movement, has always been important. We would have children working in factories without the labor movement. We wouldn't have weekends without the labor movement. We wouldn't have holidays without the labor movement. Construction workers wouldn't have hard hats. They used to die because they would be working and a rock cement would fall. Death. Labor unions fought for that. And then every worker, even when they're not trade unionized, benefits from that. We should all, praise all, the labor movement for having given us basically civilization in many ways. Karl Polanyi talks about this. The history of capitalism was always, different forces, and the movement side, social movements, it's not just labor movement, the green movement, the student movement, the feminist movement, the black movement has always been critical to making capitalism acceptable and better over time. It doesn't mean capitalism is good, but movements matter. So when people are left behind, there are movements trying to make sure that doesn't happen. But if you outlaw unions, in the big tech companies, is it surprising that then we end up also with problems? And it's not, again, I don't want to obsess just about trade unions, but it means there's governance structures. We can govern a transition, by bringing together different stakeholders to talk about what is the future, not just of the sector, but of an economy. How do we make it inclusive, innovation-driven, sustainable? And if you just have one side, business, making demands, and everyone else is supposed to cave down because otherwise the business will leave, whether it's Pfizer or Elon Musk or whoever, then it's not surprising people are left behind. And if you have government that doesn't know its role, it gets captured, is corrupted, or just isn't very smart because it hasn't invested in its own brain, it will easily get captured, or it will also easily, pocket money. We also have that problem globally, so I don't want to just blame the business side. But that's why we need to admit that how we create value matters. We don't need stakeholder value instead of shareholder value as an ex post problem. We need to create value differently from the beginning. And that's what I'm interested in, through the work that I do also with my students and the research. It's what does pre-distribution mean? How do you get capital-labor relations right from the beginning? How do you get public-private relationships right from the beginning? How do you bring voices of citizens and people experiencing policies, helping to design those policies from the beginning? So voice. Albert Hirschman, a very famous development economist, talked about voice. So these are the big questions of our time. And if we don't do it, of course people get left behind. It's not surprising.
Yeah. You mentioned the anger in France and in the US, and that brings me to the next question, which is we are going through a rise of extremist movements in Europe, and not only Europe, in other countries. We are seeing populist governments.
Not in Argentina.
Not in Argentina. We are seeing the rise of openly populistic governments. And we very often link this to the impoverishment of working class, and I wonder if there's also a little bit of cliche in this. If the issue is a little bit more complex than this. What's your take on this?
I mean, it's a huge question, and there's people who've actually written a lot about this, the rise of not just populism, but of this incredible disaffection, disillusionment amongst people, and what's actually happened to our societies where, think of coming back to the US, Detroit, where literally people have been completely left behind. Is it surprising that people then potentially, don't even vote, let alone maybe go to parties that aren't even in their self-interest? But I think we need to think about what's happened to the left, the progressives. I know in Italy, for example, the old Communist Party, which in Italy was always, if you want, a soft communist party, but it was a communist party which later became the PD. Today it's called Partito Democratico. The history of that party used to be a party with a lot of street presence in the street. They had also mutual help organizations in the street. It was much more in connection with people. And I would argue, and it's not my expertise, but I've seen it happen, it became much more of an intellectual movement. They lost that street presence. The right in Italy, the Lega Lombarda, the Lega Nord, learned the lesson from the left, and they went to the street. They have a stronger street presence. Forget what they're saying, the populism, anti-immigration. It's completely a xenophobic party. But they learned from the left when the left actually, I think, had more ambition on having real engagement. And, we could, again, talk about this forever, but I think there's lessons to be learned about what does it mean to have real empathy, not sympathy. Sympathy is a bit, condescending. Empathy means the art of listening, putting yourself in someone's shoes. And if we have progressive parties that no longer have the institutional kind of, organizational form where they're putting themselves in the position of truly listening or bringing this notion of stakeholder value for real into even their economic policies, or if in some countries the progressives worry more about redistribution, right, which is important. We all believe in I believe in redistribution. Progressive redistribution, not regressive redistribution. That's important. That's why tax policy is important. But if that's all you know how to do, and you just promise that you will give money to poor people, or you will, have different ways of limiting the wealth of, say, the rich, and you don't have a radical new agenda on how to create wealth differently, create value differently, then it's not surprising that some on the right who pretend at least to talk about wealth and value also sound as if they understand the economy more. And I'm not talking about the extreme populists who, to be honest, don't sound like they know anything about the economy. But what's interesting is even just the right and left. I think the left, especially now, there's all these elections I'm witnessing, and like in the Labour Party in the UK, will win the election because the Tories have done everything they can to lose. So literally Labour is just sitting there waiting for them to lose. They don't even have to do anything. But I'm very worried that you have a left narrative in the UK that has so little courage, that has so little explicit, proactive, ambitious, interesting in some ways narrative about how to create a very different relationship with business. When they lost the election, when Ed Miliband lost the election with David Cameron, all the ministers, intellectuals on the left, but also some of the ministers, including Rachel Reeves, who today will be the chancellor for Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, said we lost because we were not business friendly. So that idea that you have to be business friendly in order to win the election, or that you have to show that you're responsible with your fiscal budget, which means you say, oh, we will spend X billion on a green transition. Oh shit, no, we can't. We have no money. We'll spend less. As opposed to saying, we will spend ambitiously, like Kennedy said with the moon. We might fail along the way, but we're going to do it strategically to create economy-wide transformation, which will expand productive capacity so that, yes, it will cost money It might even cost a lot of money because these are radical challenges that need investment instead of a cost mentality. But because we will do it well, and here's our plan, how we will work, with business, but towards a plan, towards a goal, it will expand productive capacity. So what matters is that. It's the denominator. And with a direction. Growth with a direction, but we have an industrial strategy, an innovation policy, which is goal-oriented, and it'll cost this amount, but ultimately, it will, drive a different type of growth, and we will then redistribute that growth in a way that causes less inequality, not more inequality. We won't allow excess profits in the system. Profits are fine. You don't hear that. Yeah, so I think also the progressives, part of the reason why you also have some of this rise of the right is we have many progressive governments that either haven't had a strategy, a very interesting one, or very scared to talk about vision, ambition, strategy, because they're fearful that that's going to make it sound like they're not economically responsible. But actually, it ends up sounding just boring. Yeah, so I do think there's a bit of that part of the story too. It's a bit different about the populist rise, but if we want, progressives to be serious about the economy, then it shouldn't be about, we'll invest in X amount. Oh no, actually that's too much. X divided by 2, and that's your strategy.
I would like to ask you about fair trade, protectionism, because a national industrial policy, because I think there's a big conversation going on about that. We have seen just how the European Commission has launched tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, and also the US. The Biden administration has kept most of the tariffs that the Trump administration enforced for Chinese goods. Also, they have propelled a massive program like the Inflation Reduction Act that supports domestic manufacturing. Europe has responded with another program, and I think that some years ago we would be speaking about economic nationalism. Not today. So I guess my question is, for you, when does a national industrial policy finish and protectionism begin? What's the border between protectionism and national industrial policy?
So pure protectionism is just mercantilism, no? And it's just putting up barriers. If you don't actually invest and don't have an industrial strategy, that will definitely not lead to growth. And it could even lead to inflation. You're just making things cost more. So it's not this kind of black and white dichotomous choice. We have always had tariffs. My colleague Ha-Joon Chang wrote a book called Kicking Away the Ladder. My own book, again, The Entrepreneurial State. Fred Bloch's book about this as well has always looked about the falsity about talking about the free market. The US would have never developed without tariffs. And so it's wrong that they tell developing countries they're not allowed to have, kind of those kinds of policies when they always protected themselves in order to develop, infant industries. Those industries, when they were developing, needed a bit of protection, even just to learn, to be able to do learning by doing without getting, massacred right away. However, if it's, again, just protectionism, that literally is just mercantilism. So I think the real question is, first of all, these tariffs and, on electric vehicles and so on, is that going to allow you in the US to develop an electric vehicle market without having a proper industrial strategy around that? And the US does have the IRA Act. They have other types of industrial strategies, which, by the way, are not really new. The reason I wrote The Entrepreneurial State was I said the US has an industrial strategy. That's why we have Silicon Valley. Europe doesn't have an industrial strategy. However, now industrial strategy is no longer a bad word. So the US admits to have an industrial strategy. The word is there, at least it's used. In the book I said the US talks like Jefferson, but acts like Hamilton, who was a famous US treasurer who had a very active industrial strategy. But so the real question is, how do you structure this industrial strategy? that the U.S. has. The IRA, if you look at the IRA, the CHIPS Act, and some of the COVID recovery in the U.S., it's $5 trillion. How do you say trillion in Spanish? No.
Billion.
Yeah, but then what's a billion?
No, miles de millones.
Okay, yeah.
Trillion
so
is
huge,
billion.
That billion is not the same as billones. Okay, anyway, the U.S. is 5 trillion, 5 billones, no? But if you structure it badly, so it's just a giveaway, socializing risks, privatizing rewards, not only will it maybe also not create that competitiveness that you need, but also increases inequality. So what's interesting in the US right now is not the tariffs, it's what has been happening, which is new in the US, where they're starting to get serious, but no one really talks about it, with making sure that the businesses benefiting from this big strategy have to change. So the CHIPS Act, which you might have heard of, it's part of this bucket of money, has within it conditions that the semiconductor companies, which the idea is that Asia is making all the chips, we need sovereignty, so we need American production of chips. The chips producers in the US have to improve working conditions, use energy efficient supply chains, and are not allowed to use share buybacks. When you buy back your shares to boost share prices, stock options, and executive pay. That's what's interesting of what's happening in the US. It's not true they're just doing the tariffs. Yeah, they actually have an industrial policy. There's a problem with it, by the way, because the IRA, by creating all these subsidies, is drowning out, is attracting a lot of green capital from Africa, for example. So because climate change is global, we can't have a green strategy in the US that puts at risk green strategies elsewhere. But that's about global governance, which is a whole other conversation. But I think what we should do is not just look at the headlines, EV tariffs. We should look at what's actually happening in the US, including Biden saying, I'm a union man. He went on the picket line, by the way, when the trade unions, as I said before, were striking. So making sure there's a good deal with labor. So these are the issues we should talk about. We shouldn't go back 60 years. Are tariffs good or bad? What we know is industrial strategy is important. Without it, nothing happens. Good industrial strategy, not stupid industrial strategy. What is stupid industrial strategy? Just giving out money to sectors and picking winners. Just thinking, here's money, go do something good. So this idea of having, again, not only conditionality, but mission orientation, and to combine these different instruments and working with good business, not bad business. So having those conditions with the semiconductor companies, having the conditions that NASA had with the companies, no excess profits, having the conditions that the German public bank has with the steel sector, or Mia Motley, as I mentioned, she has a very big ambition of making Barbados, which is tiny, 300,000 people, the greenest blue and green tourism kind of island in the world. It's a small island state, or you can see it as a large ocean state. So the blue economy, the green economy, she wants to make it the most ambitious blue-green small island state in the world. But that means a different relationship with the hotel chains. Right? What is the condition that you work with hotels to make them not extractive, but part of this kind of transformation of an island? And if they're not willing, and they weren't willing, because during COVID she had a transformation program where, because the hotels had no tourists, they were meant to be investing in the repurpose, reuse, recycle, production methods across the tourism sector and train workers, and they refused. So again, coming back to, it's a challenge, it's a negotiation, it's a deal, and learning from different countries, including the CHIPS Act, how to do that well. And Europe, instead of just creating money and giving it to Spain and to Italy, hoping for the best, if that money lands where you just have a health minister who gives in to, not you, a health minister who gives in to any demand from a pharmaceutical company, that money's wasted. So the ambition you have, or the ambition we see in Brazil, where the minister Trindade is putting health at the center of the industrial strategy, they're calling it the HEIC, Health, Economy, Industrial Complex, not not the military industrial complex, but health and well-being at the center of an industrial complex, that requires a massive change in the relationship between the pharmaceutical industry, university research, government, small biotech companies. And that's all we should be talking about, because if we care about climate, health, and digital, how we govern these processes with all the different tools and the healthy, I keep talking, you need to shut me up at some point, relationship, that matters. Yeah, we should ask questions.
No. I want to ask you about the big con, but first, we're talking a lot about NASA and about American innovations, and I would like to ask you why the iPhone hasn't been invented in Europe. Why the big techs are not in Europe? Is it government's fault, like many people say?
So the reason I wrote El Estado Emprendedor 11 years ago, so entrepreneurial state, was that usually what people said is, why are all the Googles, the Amazons in the US and not Europe? And the answer was, oh, the US has venture capital. We need more venture capital. Or the US has a low capital gains tax, or has allowed the financial sector to finance innovation, and there's good tax policy there. Let's lower tax and structure capital gains tax like they do. And so I wrote the book saying, wrong. If you want to talk about the US, then maybe you should study a bit of history. And every single technology that's in your smartphone, which makes it smart and not stupid. You don't say, let me speak to my stupid phone. You have smartphone. The smart technology, internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, all of it was publicly financed. It doesn't mean you don't need a smart company, Apple, to put together that technology in a wonderful product, which obviously we all like because we have it. Is that an Apple phone? Yeah. And if you read the history of Steve Jobs, the biography, it's very interesting how he believed in design. The people who worked in Apple under Steve Jobs came from the music sector, design, they were artists, also mathematicians. He made this beautiful, simple, product. But without the smart technology, it would have been a simple, beautiful, stupid product, right? So what I said in the entrepreneurial state is, wake up. This was during the period of austerity, by the way, when I wrote it, because in the UK, we had Cameron, who was saying civil servants are the enemies of enterprise, and saying we need to become competitive like the US. We need to cut tax, we need to cut public spending, cut the civil service. And I was like, all right, hold on. Not only is austerity terrible for the reasons I said before, it's also never going to get you the Silicon Valley you love so much, because here's the history of Silicon Valley. And so the reason we don't have those companies in the in Europe, is we don't have, definitely not until, I think things are changing a bit, but we don't have that dynamic, decentralized network of state institutions across our governments that are outcomes oriented. It's not surprising all the technology I just mentioned came out of the military industrial complex. As I said, the question is, why do we only know how to do this stuff out of the military industrial complex? That's why I'm interested in health and the health industry complex, which Brazil is doing under Lula. But also, what didn't work in the US was the corporate governance structure. So huge amounts of public money, entrepreneurial state, and rising inequality. So California, where Silicon Valley happened, they used to actually have a very dynamic school system and university system. All this money that was created in California, how much of it actually went back into, public education, public university? We ended up socializing risks and privatizing rewards in the whole country, just California as an example. And the companies like Apple moved one of its headquarters, part of it, to Reno, Nevada, from Cupertino, California, just to avoid tax. They saved, the year they did that, I tell the story in the book, they saved $3 billion, American billions, not your trillions. Anyway, why can't we figure out numbers? Anyway, 3 millones of dollars to move. No, it's not just tax evasion globally, moving to Ireland and all these tax havens. Even the states compete. So that's a dysfunctional way for the government to work with business. You provide all this technology, it goes into the iPhone, it makes mega profits, and then they avoid tax. Again, it's just crazy that that's even allowed. And by the way, under Steve Jobs, Apple did no share buybacks, or very little. He was actually a good CEO. I mean, I'm not talking about him as a person, but the company benefited from a CEO who just thought about innovation, and they reinvested their money back into production. Tim Cook, the new CEO, how much innovation do you think we've had in Apple recently? Is there any radical innovation? Or are we having minor innovations around the iPhone and so on? It's not surprising, and I've written about this, about Apple, that's a very financialized company, and it's having record level share buyback schemes, just giving the money back to shareholders and so on. So corporate governance also matters, and that's why Europe should not be so cowardly when it thinks of the US. It should learn about what worked in Silicon Valley, but also what didn't work. And the fact that Europe has a more functional, I think, corporate governance model, especially in places like Scandinavia, where trade unionists are on the board of companies, where we also still fund the welfare state instead of the barbaric situation we have in the US, where people die, not because they're sick, but because they can't afford health care. It reminds me of Rosa Luxemburg when she said socialism or barbarism. It's barbaric. Have you been to San Francisco recently? The level of inequality in the streets, it's like, I feel nauseous. I walk around, it's terrible. Yeah. So the US is not a model to follow. It is barbaric. However, we should learn what worked. And the Silicon Valley story is a story of very ambitious, outcomes-oriented public investment. And then the inequality that's risen is because we didn't govern it very well.
The big con. I would like to ask you about this book you wrote with Rosie Collington, because, and let me say the whole title, because I think it's important. How the consulting industry weakens our businesses, infantilizes our governments, and warps our economies. I was reading it, and I wonder if you had relatives working in the consultancy industry and you are invited to Christmas dinners. Yeah. And if you had friends from college that worked there and talked to you. I would like to ask you, why is it a con, and what's good consultancy and bad consultancy?
Yeah, so it's called el gran engaño in Spanish. Yeah. The big con is nicer because the word consulting. Yeah. And Rosie Collington is my PhD student, so I was going to write the book by myself, but then I wanted to write it much quicker because I saw how much was being spent during COVID on consultants. The UK government, where I live, we were giving Deloitte 1.5 million a day to do the test and trace. And they failed miserably because they have no expertise. So the big con, in Italian we call it aria fritta. You have air, you fry it, it's still air. So if there's no knowledge or value by the consultant, but they just ask you for your watch to tell you the time and then leave with your watch, which is a nice summary of how consulting industry works, then you have a problem. If, however, governments can't do everything on their own. There's no problem having advisors and consultants. From the Middle Ages, governments have had advisors. A nurse can consult. A doctor can consult. An academic. My father does nuclear fusion. If the government wants a fusion strategy, it'd be normal to go to the top fusion climate people. Potsdam, which is a wonderful university in Germany, has some of the top climate scientists in the world. I was just with one of them, Johan Rockström. He consults with governments on his knowledge, which has been developed for a long time. So he's bringing value. So that's one problem. To what degree do these consultants actually bring value? Or is it aria fritta? Good. You understand? Italian, Spanish, una faccia, una razza. Same language. Anyway, but the other problem is, even if they do bring value, which of course they do, it's, McKinsey has so much money, it would be crazy if they don't have some climate knowledge. Mm-hmm. Do they have an incentive to make the government smarter after the contract? Or are they benefiting from a government that actually doesn't have the capacity? So as an academic, if you're working with the government, you're trying to share your knowledge, make those civil servants smarter around that policy, and you're not just looking for another contract. It would be like a therapist. If you were in therapy your whole life, like Woody Allen, the movies, you probably don't have a very good therapist, right? So why do governments keep working with the same consultants even when the things they do not only fail, but they're not finding themselves to be more capable? Or even worse, when that same consultant industry is working on both sides of the street. In South Africa, consulting with Eskom, a state-owned enterprise in energy, and with the Treasury that is supposed to be regulating Eskom. Choose which side. You can't be on both. In Australia, we had PwC a consulting company working with the medical device industry and with the medical device regulator. Again, it's not rocket science to know this will be a problem. And lastly, why, I actually blame governments, to be honest. Why are they entering these ridiculous relationships? And if the narrative, it's coming back to everything we've just talked about, is that the civil service is the problem, it's not the solution, and you're not allowed to make mistakes. Venture capitalists and the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs brag about the mistakes. We had to fail, we embraced risk, you're learning by doing, trial and error, and then bang, success. And look at me, how smart I am because I was willing to fail. If as soon as a civil servant fails, or a minister fails, they're on the front page of the newspaper. So we don't allow them to learn. That's why we call it the infantilization of government. You can't learn how to ride a bicycle if you don't fall. If that's the case, then it's not surprising that even when they have the capacity, which they often don't because they didn't invest in it, even when they have it, like in the case of Australia, they had the climate capacity, they prefer to move the risk somewhere else because they're so risk averse, because they're not allowed to embrace the risk taking. It comes back full circle to how I began. When Kennedy said, we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy, that's embracing the learning by doing, the trial and error. So we need to admit that all these problems from climate, health, digital divide will require, that kind of embracing of uncertainty, which means we need to also structure governments to have safe places to test things out. In Chile, they have a laboratorio de gobierno. It's like a laboratory within government that tests out new practice, like the outcomes-oriented procurement. No, las compras públicas hechas por Misión. That you need to learn how to do that, so you can test it out across different ministries, make them learn from each other, whether it's for the school meals that we talked about today. Sweden has a school meal mission, the lunch, la comida, en las escuelas in Suecia, Sweden, have to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. So that required the civil service to think about what would that look like to do that differently from before. If you're not allowed to test, then of course, as soon as you're given a challenge, if you're going to be blamed for the mistake, let someone else do it. So all these problems of not investing in state capacity, of having no incentive from the consultants to make sure the government is smarter in the next round, having, being on both sides of the street, and this issue of what was the last issue I just said? Whatever it was, of not being allowed to make mistakes. It's not surprising that we then have this over-consultification of global governments, and it's up to 1 trillion now. So I don't know how to say trillion.
And it also comes from Great Depression. I think McKinsey began by then.
Well, McKinsey came out in the 1920s, and it's interesting. In Mission Economy, I talk about the head of procurement. You can see I'm obsessed with procurement. The head of procurement at NASA, during the Apollo program, started to see that NASA itself was giving contracts to the consultants. And he said, we won't even know how to work with the private sector if we continue to outsource our brain. So he said, we need to work with the private sector. So 400,000 people worked on the Apollo mission, most of them in the private sector, but with a very clear role of government and setting everything I said before. And he said, we won't know how to do that in the future. We won't even understand like all these different problems that we're helping to guide and to, also invest in and so on. And his exact quote was, we will get captured, government will get captured captured by brochuremanship, because they didn't have the fancy PowerPoints that McKinsey uses now. So they just had these like shiny brochures that would say, work with us, we're really smart, you know, the aria fritta. And he said, we won't even understand which business to work with if we are just consultifying NASA. So he warned about it. And I mean, I've written about NASA, how it is today, but that's a separate story.
Artificial intelligence.
Don't we ask them? Can't they ask us questions or no? We're not doing questions?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
they. Okay, next question, please ask about artificial intelligence. No, tiene razón la profesora Mazzucato. Vamos a dejar los próximos minutos para...
We're going to leave the few minutes that we have left for questions from the audience, and the last half hour or so, she will be signing books, and I wouldn't miss that for the world either. I don't know how to give the mic to the audience.
Talking about populism around the world, the rise of right, if you had the hypothetical situation where the current leader of Argentina listens to you, what would you advise him to do? What things is he doing right? What things are he doing worse? And he has popularized the Austrian Economic Academy mindset.
Sorry, which one? Hayek?
The Austrian Economic...
Austrian.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
What critics would you do to the academic mindset of the Austrian economics? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Are we getting 2 or 3 or just one?
No,
sí.
¿Preferís así?
¿Cómo preferís?
Okay.
Sí.
Yes, take a few of them and...
Thank you very much for the presentation, the conference, sorry. So I'm following the idea on the entrepreneur state. I'm very interested about one thing that is troubling these big firms, that is effective decision making, okay? So we are looking at these companies that are more hierarchical than the state, obviously, in which obviously you have a CEO.
Sorry, around what? Water?
Effective decision making about whatever they are looking at. For example, you have this new company founded by Jeff Bezos, the Blue Space, something like that they are looking at this, and he talked about this effective decision making in which innovation is just about lucky and timing, right? Innovation without timing is just a fancy thing, right? So in this parallel of this entrepreneur state, how do you see democratic states taking this effective decision making, meaning the Congress and the legislative and the executive taking the right decision at the right moment? How do you see that? Is this necessary to restructure the state? There is something necessary to change, in this, especially in the situation of high polarization? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sure.
Thank you very much. Really inspiring. Your Mission Economy book, it really inspired us, my co-authors. We wrote a book called The Patient Priority on transforming healthcare systems around the world. And specifically, one of our chapters highlights your book and talks about how governments have a strong role to define the mission, shape the markets, and make game-changing bets. The question I have, and what I'd love to learn from your example, is given the short time period that many governments have in office, how can we get some of these longer-term initiatives going that we saw with DARPA in the U.S., that we saw with, getting the people onto the moon? What can we learn from that, and how can we make these longer-term? Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. So I should have President Fernandez answer the first one. No. So first of all, I think we need to be careful. I've seen it in other parts of the world. You might have a person in Argentina, now it's Milei, and I'll be very open. There's no point in, I just think the guy's a bit of a joke because I don't take seriously what he says, because I don't think he takes it seriously. And I think we need to be careful because that's who you hear, that's who you see, but behind that actually is perhaps a more calm system that is benefiting from having a puppet screaming, but that's where we should be looking at. What are the different forces? And I'm thinking also, again, across the world, but you should be careful not to personalize that leader, no? Like, let's look at the alliances that might actually be a bit hidden behind a particular leader. So you just hear the one, throwing mud and spitting and, even think of Trump. look at how Trump speaks and look at the alliance actually much quieter, more dignified, hiding behind the scenes in the Republican Party, which has, the crazy guy just saying sometimes very strange things. But if we just focus on the individual, we're missing out from really understanding what's happening there. And the reason I say you don't take Milei very seriously is that it's not even about right-wing economics. It just makes no economic sense whatsoever. So I would say it's just, and that's why I started to think, is that actually just hiding a bit of something that's happening behind, and they're just trying to distract with this kind of almost nonsensical propaganda, which is what I see him saying. However, then the other part of your question, which is key, is because then you're assuming when you talk about Hayek that Milei is about Hayek, or Milei is about the free market ideology, or Milei is about some sort of right-wing supply-side economics. And what I just said is that's not true. I don't see any rationality, to be honest, even on the right, behind what Milei is saying. It's just kind of very old school, get rid of tax, get rid of the public service, get rid of everything public and make everything private. No one thinks like that anymore. Like, he's almost 200, or not even 200 years, because actually people back then didn't think this way. But anyway, so Hayek is about his actual writing, and the Austrian school, for example, is about learning. It's about how to use the price system itself as a discovery process. It was never about the free market. And if you look at the history of the concept of the free market, even in Adam Smith, it wasn't about, just using the price system, just using the private sector. Not only did Adam Smith talk a lot about morality, in his theory of moral sentiments, but also when he talked about the free market, he was very interested in the rents in the system, just like the physiocrats in the 1700s. He wrote shortly after the physiocrats. He was worried about rent seeking. So the free market was free from rent. It wasn't free from the state. So the ideologues, the propaganda of someone like Milei, who says no more state, too many civil servants, and with his, what was it? It's kind of just stupid, and it doesn't resonate even with someone like Adam Smith, who was the first real economist who talked about the importance of actually getting that right division of public and private. I don't think Adam Smith was right on everything, but he was a very deep thinker. And his main theory was we need a division of labor in production, his pin factory example in The Wealth of Nations, and we need to make sure the profits that are generated are reinvested back into production, so organizational change. He was worried if money would just be extracted out of the system. He was interested in productivity, division of labor, growth, and if you add that all up, wealth of nations. He looked at the role of government. It was pretty minimal, but at least he thought about what that role was. Fast forward, you've had lots of different theorists who've thought about the role of government, disagreeing amongst themselves, but I don't know anyone who just says you don't need government. My own work is saying it can't just be Keynesian, it can't just be counter-cyclical. We also need government capacity, right? And if you're just throwing money at problems in a counter-cyclical way, which Keynes did not say, by the way, but some Keynesians just see the counter-cyclical, then you actually have no theory of government in the boom if it's just counter-cyclical. And most of the investments in the iPhone happen in the boom. So you had the state leading even in the boom to shape the market, not just fix the market. So to me, anyone who is a leader who just comes in and says it's all crap and just get rid of the public sectors is not even to be taken seriously. It's not a right-wing agenda. It's just a stupid agenda. And that's why I wonder, but I'm not an expert, who is really behind Milei? Because what he's saying, we know, even the right wing knows, is foolish. So maybe he's just there to distract, and there's other things happening. But again, I'm not a politician, I'm not a political scientist, but I do think we need to be careful not to just look at the guys throwing mud like Trump and Milei and look at the interests behind them that are starting to form coalitions and are just trying to move us backwards from having what I would call, slowly a more progressive system. Having said that, when people are left behind, it's not surprising also that they are, voted in, because people are very upset and angry. They're not stupid, but they're very angry, and unfortunately, when you're angry and you haven't been benefiting, that happens. Anyway, the effective decision making, very good question. I think we need to be careful with the word effective. So if it's about static efficiency versus dynamic efficiency, if we think it's linear, put this amount of money in or attention to a decision and you get this output, then we don't understand also these complex processes, and the feedback effects that should be in the modeling, for example. And I think that, take a government that is interested in obesity, let's just say, there's about 200 factors that determine obesity. Yeah, and if you think it's just going to be an easy process, have a plan, talk about obesity, and somehow magic will happen without actually making sure that the civil servants have their fingers on some of those key pressure points, working with some of the most, the experts who actually have the expertise and not the aria frita, then it's going to be impossible. And so, but the question of the democratic decision-making is, I think, key. But before you get to the democratic, you need to at least have invested in your ability to welcome these uncertain processes where experience matters, learning by doing. How do you then bring democracy into that when we're talking about not the moon landing? Do we need democracy for the moon landing? Maybe, I don't know. Do we need democracy for a net zero strategy in a city? For sure. Do we need democracy in thinking about health and well-being? For sure. So for me, at least, I've been learning from some countries that have been interested in how do you bring the people who experience a policy to the table to help design the policy. So an example would be in Camden, where, again, I live, but I think we really need to learn from the local places, as I said. The way that we started to introduce outcomes-oriented missions and procurement was to get people who were experiencing the policy. The example was adult social care in the social housing estates in Camden, the carers, often women who do the caring, and the people being cared for to work with Camden to better inform outcomes-oriented procurement for adult social care in the council. And I know it sounds a bit technical and boring, but actually it's so important. The Pope, by the way, when he talks about the common good, he talks about the principle of subsidiarity. So bring the decision-making to the most local level possible. He talks about the preferential option for the poor, which is about not just redistribution, but again, get the voices of the poor as part of the system. And I'm not very religious. In fact, when he put me on a council, he got attacked, but then he said, but she believes in humanity, because they say, I'm an atheist, abortionist, I never wrote about abortion, communist, and he said, no, I chose her because she believes in humanity. But then I met him and he said, Mariana, me dicen que no eres muy religiosa.
Mariana, they're telling me that you're not very religious, but you have 4 children, so...
I really like this Pope, even as someone who's not very religious. To be honest, what is religion, right? We all have our own way of being religious. So let's not get into this. Spirituality, so on, that's another conversation. However, the reason I really admire this Pope is he's serious when he talks about things like the common good. And economists, when we talk about good, it's just a correction for something that's not happening. The public good in economics sounds good, 2 words, one is good, but it's just a correction for a market failure, for something the private sector is not investing in because of the characteristics of non-excludable, non-rival. We don't actually talk about good as what we're trying to do. The objective and the how matters as much as the what. So I think the democracy bit has to be in that issue of whose voices are even at the table, in defining, for example, these missions, which when they're societal, can't just be 5 guys in a room, Kissinger and so on, to tell us all what the next space race will be. And your question about the short-termism, a lot of my critique has been short-termism in business, but also short-termism in government. Not just through the electoral cycle, but especially. And so learning not just about government, but public organizational capacity in terms of what have we learned from DARPA. DARPA was the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the US military that funded the internet and many other things, including AI, artificial intelligence. All the early investments in it, actually many of them came out of DARPA. But the organizational form, not just the people, the form, how they reward risk-taking, how long people come in for, 5 years, and it's not linked with the electoral cycle, how they form the job structure. You're rewarded for failing. The whole big bets thing, that has to do also with the human resource policy. I spoke to Cheryl Martin, who was the first director of ARPA-E, like DARPA, but for energy. In 2014, I brought all these mission-oriented organizations from around the world, including Corfo in Chile, KfW, BBC, DARPA, ARPA-E, to share their experience of stepping out of that little box of market fixing. And one of the questions was, how do you actually embrace the risk-taking instead of fearing it? And she said, we literally evaluate people in the organization by how much risk they were willing to take and how much big impact the few successes they have. She talked about economy-wide success. So what they actually cared about was the big impact of your few successes, which they knew would never come about if they were always going with the easy win. So anyway, the point is, because we value the private sector, we have business schools that have case study, Harvard Business School, very famous, case study methodology, learning from business experience, what works, what doesn't, how did they do it, rejuvenating the mature corporation. Whereas because we don't value the public sector, that same attention to the details, what works, what doesn't, what was the organizational form, what does DARPA look like in the health sector or in energy, why is it different because it's not related to the military? How can we embrace the risk-taking so you don't get so risk-averse? You need McKinsey, even though when they don't know what they're doing, blah, blah, blah. That's why I set up this institute in London called the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL. It's a public university, because I think it's impossible to get better policy without paying attention to these questions, which includes retraining the education, the curriculum for the civil service, which currently is still the Chicago School version of training, which is public choice theory and new public management, where not only is it all about market failures, even worse, government failure. Of course government fails, but if you're so fearful of failing that you're not allowed to try anything, of course you end up with these problems, which doesn't mean we should allow government just to fail, or to take risks for the sake of taking risks. That's not a value. But you need to, what is public purpose? What is public value? What is market shaping versus these old framings? And for me, that's where the progressive agenda must be, because we will not reduce inequality, we will not tackle global warming, we will not be prepared for the next pandemic with the current structures and mindset we have. Che Guevara, no, he said new mindset, new brain. It's not, I don't know why I said Che Guevara, but he talked about the new man, the new woman. And I do think within the civil service, we need a new way of thinking. It's not just about policy.
Creo que no nos dejan tiempo para más.
I don't think we have time for more questions. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Gracias.
It's been a pleasure.